All right. And Gary, we are recording. So thanks so much for taking the time to connect with me today.
My pleasure.
I appreciate it. A fan of yours. And Gary Taubes, for those who don't know, is an investigative science and health journalist. And Gary is the co-founder of the nonprofit nutrition science initiative, the newside.org. Gary, you're the author of Rethinking Diabetes, which just came out. You also wrote The Case Against Sugar. You wrote Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. You wrote Good Calories, Bad Calories. So you're a thought leader on obesity, on calories, and carbohydrate based diets as well. What did I miss there?
The Case for Keto, which was my second to
Ah,
last book, and
okay.
the fact that I'm a controversial thought leader. So there's
Yeah.
a significant proportion of the people in the field who think I'm wrong. I keep a list of books that include chapters explaining why I'm wrong. And
So let's talk about that. What do you mean you're controversial?
Okay, so I investigative journalist, science journalist. The first 15 years of my life, I focused on controversial science, my professional life. In the late 90s, I moved into nutrition. I did a series of investigative pieces for the journal Science that won national reporting awards in science journalism. And then I did this infamous New York Times Magazine cover story, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie, which implied that perhaps the person who knew the most about obesity in the modern era was Robert Atkins, author of Dr. Atkins' Diet Revolution. And that was probably the most controversial. That was 22 years ago. It was probably the most controversial piece, or among the top 3 that the New York Times Magazine ever ran. And it got me a large book advance that allowed me to spend 4 years of my life working on researching and writing a book on nutrition and chronic disease science. I spent 5 years, which is sort of the nature of being a nonfiction author. And that book purported, called Good Calories, Bad Calories, published in 2007, attempted to shift the thinking on diet and chronic disease. So until I came along in 2000, and a lot of other people as well, I wasn't the only one. The conventional thinking was a healthy diet is defined as basically a low fat, low sodium diet with fruits, vegetables, whole grains. And if you struggle with your weight, the key is to eat less and exercise more, even though it was admitted that eating less and exercising more doesn't actually work. And then I came along, and in the course of my research, thanks in large part to the internet maturing to the point where I could do more research in 4 years than anyone else had ever done in their lifetime, I wrote a book trying to shift this thinking. So obesity becomes not a energy balance, calories in, calories out problem, but an endocrine problem focused on the hormone insulin. Some diet book doctors, most notably Michael and Mary Dan Eads of Protein Power and Barry Sears of The Zone, had discussed this. Atkins to some extent, and that the problem with modern diets was not the fat content or the saturated fat content or the salt content, but the refined grains and sugars in the diet.
And
So yeah, just to say, an implication was that the nutrition and obesity researchers had basically, to use a non-technical term, fucked up. And nobody likes to be told by a journalist outside of their field, nonetheless, that they had spent their entire career working on wrong paradigms, coming to the wrong conclusions. So a justifiable result was to make me very controversial.
And with that philosophy, you wrote Rethinking Diabetes, What Science Reveals About Diet, Insulin, and Successful Treatments. Can you
Yeah.
talk about what that book represents and what the points are that you try to get across in that book? I read the book, and I think others should as well. It brings a lot of good data to this issue. So what's the main premise of the book, and what is the criticism or pushback against it?
Okay, so the since that 2007 book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, I've basically been unpacking the arguments in that book. So I had a chapter specifically on the sugar in Good Calories, Bad Calories, and I wrote a book against Case Against Sugar that came out in 2016 that unpacked all that science and added significantly more research. The ultimate argument is we've had these epidemics of chronic disease worldwide, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, they known as diseases of Western diets and lifestyles. And like I said, the conventional wisdom was they're caused by ultimately by eating too much and maybe energy dense foods and lack of fruits and vegetables in modern diets, lack of physical activity. And I basically argued it's sugar and refined grains are the problem, picking up on arguments that British researchers had made in the 1960s. And then if you are on the spectrum from being overweight to obese to pre-diabetic to diabetes, if you're metabolically unhealthy, then the way to fix it is not just to remove the sugar and refined grains, which basically the advice you're getting when you're being told to eat whole foods, but to remove all carbohydrate-rich foods. So you're eating what when I was young was called the Atkins diet. Now it's keto. The extreme example is carnivore. So the benefits of those diets, as much as anything, or maybe primarily, come from removing the carbohydrates. So diabetes offered an opportunity to both research this story, but also to do so in a disease entity in which everyone acknowledges that the symptoms of the disease are a response to the carbohydrate content of the diet. So type 1 diabetes, you're insulin deficient, your pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin, and you can't tolerate the carbohydrate content in your diet. And type 2 diabetes, you're insulin resistant. Should be a different disease, but again, it's the history. Because of the history, we think of them both as diabetes. They're both insulin dysregulation disorders, and because the insulin is being secreted in response to the carbohydrate content of the diet, it gave an opportunity to discuss again the history of the thinking in these fields, how they evolved. It gave me an opportunity as a writer to do the research, to really learn that history and tell it in a way that it's never been told. And as for the controversy, the responses, the criticisms, I would say at this point there aren't any yet. So what happens when you're in this field for going on 22 years since I first published my New York Times Magazine article is your research begins as very controversial, and people don't want to read it because they assume you're wrong, and then it just becomes an old story. So I wrote the diabetes book, in effect, for the diabetes community, physicians who treat diabetic patients, exactly the same people that the American Diabetes Association wants to reach with its guidelines, as well as the people who write the guidelines. But the challenge is getting them to read it. Actually, if you have a second, I'll tell you a funny story that's relevant.
Tell us the story.
Okay, my first book was called Nobel Dreams. I lived in a physics lab outside Geneva, CERN, and I spent 10 months watching physicists very smart physicists, realize how they had screwed up an experiment and embarrassed themselves. And I had gone off to write what I thought was going to be a book about a great breakthrough, and I ended up writing an expose about the high energy world of the controversial world of high energy physics. And a few years after the book came out, it was very controversial. A physicist friend of mine was at a conference, and he met one of the characters I wrote about in the book, who was the sort of chief factotum to the Nobel laureate who ran this collaboration I was writing about. And he asked this fellow, Dave Klein, what he thought of my book. And Dave said, "It's crap, I haven't read it." And my friend thought, how do you know it's crap if you haven't read it? But that response, it's crap, I haven't read it, is a legitimate response to any book that argues something we inherently don't believe to be true. And so the job of someone like me is always to get the research community to get over their "it's crap, I haven't read it," and to at least get to the stage where they can say it's crap because of this, this, and this, because they have read it.
Got it. Wow, it's
Eh,
like they don't even want to consider it. And so some critics have argued that the emphasis on low carb, high fat diets lacks robust long term evidence. And how do you respond to that type of criticism? And what evidence do you find most compelling in support of your view?
Okay, so let me give you the context of your question, which is getting back to what the book argues. There are two ways to control your blood sugar. So one way the other diabetes is one significant, if not the most meaningful symptom of diabetes is uncontrolled blood sugar, high blood sugar, large variations in blood sugar. And there are two ways to control it, by drugs and by diet. Okay, the first drug control was insulin in 1921. It was a wonder drug, and until 1921, diabetes was controlled. The standard of care, in effect, both in the US and Europe, by all the major diabetes researchers, was to tell their diabetic patients not to eat carbohydrates because they couldn't metabolize them safely, and to replace the carbohydrate content of the diet with fat. So from 1797 to essentially 1921, that was the standard of care. And for type 2 diabetes, it would keep the disease under control. It would keep the blood sugar under control. The patients would live relatively normal lives. For type 1, it would slow down the progression of the disease by a little bit. But type 1 is a disorder of insulin deficiency. It used to be called insulin-dependent diabetes because these patients need insulin. So when insulin's discovered in 1921, this shift in the medical that I describe in the book is a shift to drug-dependent therapy. Everybody basically gets insulin, whether they're type 1 or type 2, and insulin is used to control the disease, and diet becomes an adjunct of drug therapy. So you design the diet to make drug therapy as easy as possible. And back then there were no clinical trials, so they had no idea of the long-term effects. And then, as I argue in the book, from 2000 onward, we've started to test the pre-insulin diet. And it turns out to be just as effective for diabetes control as the pre-insulin diabetes specialists believed it was then. The problem is it's a high-fat diet. And in the 19th century, it was known as the animal diet. And it's the easiest way to do it. It's rich in animal fat, which means it's rich in saturated fat, which means it raises LDL cholesterol, which it does. And so now the question becomes, are the benefits from eating this way and perhaps getting off drug therapy worth the risks of elevating your LDL cholesterol? Which has been the focus of the second investigation I did in nutrition, was on the dietary fat science, which is built on the idea that saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol, and so we should eat either reduce saturated fat diets or reduce fat diets, control our cholesterol, and that will maximize our health and longevity. So the arguments are, well, this, among other things, is this diet for diabetes has only been tested for, depending on which clinical trials you want to look at, from 2 to 5 years. And so we have no idea of the long-term risks and benefits of eating this way. The counter argument is one of the arguments I made in my earlier work, one of the revelations from doing the investigation for Science that was published in 2000, is that the low-fat diet that we were being told to eat had never been tested, certainly not for longer than 2 to 5 years. And when it eventually was tested, it was shown not to have any benefits. So it is indeed true that this diet, there are no long-term tests of this dietary approach to diabetes. But what's equally true is there's no long-term tests. That the long-term tests for the diet, the recommended diets for our health, have failed the tests. And in theory, refuted the hypotheses that they were set out to test.
What do you think are the connections between insulin and Ozempic, and what are the risks of either one? Insulin, if we just start there, because that's what we've been talking about with diabetes, is this drug is clearly helpful for diabetic people. You've written about potential problems that insulin might cause, and then how we then have medicines to deal with those problems rather than trying to fix the root problem, which is the person's having too much sugar, right? So
if I'm right,
and you've written a lot, you've elaborated a lot on the known risks of insulin. What do you think about, you just wrote an article in The Atlantic the other day about Ozempic. So what are the risks or potential risks of Ozempic?
Okay, so let me tell you briefly again the insulin story. Remember, type 1 diabetics, patients with type 1 diabetes need insulin to survive. So when insulin is first isolated from the pancreases in 1921 at the University of Toronto, and then early 1922, it's first used experimentally on human patients. It's a lifesaver. It's a wonder drug. It's the first miracle drug. You have these patients who are at the brink of death. You give them insulin, which is what they're missing. You bring them back to life. Okay, so until then, the way to treat this disease was you can't metabolize carbohydrates, don't eat them. Now you have a drug that can treat the disease. And on top of that, the drug actually creates the condition of hypoglycemia. It's so good at controlling insulin and so difficult to dose properly that it causes low blood sugar, which can be immediately fatal or quickly fatal. So the lack of insulin will kill you over weeks to months to year. Too much insulin, very low blood sugar, can kill you in 12 hours. So doctors respond by telling their patients they have to eat carbohydrates to balance the insulin. This is what I meant by you now design the diet to fit the drug therapy, as opposed to designing the drug therapy to fit somebody who's maximizing dietary therapy. Through the 1920s, doctors realized that their patients aren't following their diet advice anyway, so let's let them eat whatever they want and give them whatever insulin is necessary to cover the carbohydrates that they're going to eat. And particularly with children, they're diagnosed with this very scary disease that's significantly going to shorten their lives even with insulin. Do you really want to tell them they can't have an ice cream cone ever again, or they can't eat birthday cake ever again? So you let them eat those foods and you give them insulin, and it spreads from children to adults. This would all be fine. But by the 1930s, a diabetes specialist realized that they're in the midst of a new kind of epidemic, very similar to what we've been experiencing over the past 50 years in everyone. So these young patients who they had kept alive with insulin are now manifesting all the sort of long-term consequences of living with diabetes. So arteriosclerosis, which is basically, atherosclerosis, but in every vein and artery in their body. They're having heart disease, strokes, they're going blind, retinopathies, neuropathies, which is nerve damage, and so they're amputations. And when you read the case studies of these kids who are now in their 20s, early 30s, a wonderful book written by a University of Pennsylvania pediatrician, medical historian, and medical ethicist named Chris Feutner called Bittersweet. What's so striking about it is these kids stayed healthy. So the insulin saves their lives. It's a wonder drug. They thrive for like 10, 15 years, and then their bodies tend to fall apart over the course of a year or two. Reading the case studies is heartbreaking. And it made me a little bit nervous about the ketogenic diet also, because as you pointed out, we only have long-term evidence for, clinical trials for 5 years. So the question is, what happens after 15 or 20 years? And then the other aspect of my book that I describe historically is all the misconceptions the diabetes community created about diabetes as a disorder, because they were responding only to how drug therapy was controlling the disease and the devices they had. And so as soon as they had insulin, it changed how they thought about the disease. Suddenly diabetes became an insulin deficiency disease because it could be controlled by adding insulin. And all these other nuances of the science got pushed aside. So now Ozempic comes along. It's a wonder drug. Undeniably does. I mean, a drug that can significantly reduce the weight in patients who struggle with obesity is an amazing thing. But like insulin, patients are going to be on it for the rest of their lives. Like insulin, if they go off it, bad things are going to happen, although they may not be as fatal as a patient with type 1 diabetes going off his or her insulin. And we have no idea what the long-term consequences are. So Ozempic itself, for the variations of these glucagon-like peptide 1 agonist, receptor agonist drugs, have been tested for out to 3 to 7 years. But we don't know what's going to happen afterwards. And like insulin, already we see the American Academy of Pediatricians, for instance, promoting these drugs for adolescents struggling with obesity. And, the burden, psychological burden of living with obesity for adolescents is terrible. And I understand that. But these are kids who are going to be on this drug for 20, 30, 50 years, and you have no idea of the long-term risks and benefits. And we won't learn it until they've been on the drug and we start seeing. And when I first tweeted about my Atlantic article, I said, this drug scares me because it's a wonder drug, because it's so effective. And I worry about the long-term risks, and I hope I'm wrong.
So I want to explore this connection or the analogy between insulin and Ozempic, and specifically, I want to understand what's so bad about insulin, because it's a miracle. You said it's a miracle drug; it saves lives, and yeah, there can be adverse side effects down the road, but certainly the benefit seems to outweigh the effects. You wrote that insulin therapy might be responsible, at least in part, for diabetic complications, and I can't pronounce this word, atherosclerosis and high blood pressure. So I guess, what my question is, isn't insulin totally worth it despite these potential complications?
Well, it's not just insulin, it's how you use the insulin. So again, when insulin was first introduced as a therapy in 1922, the thinking, which was dominated by one clinician, Elliot Joslin, who had opened the first diabetes clinic and the dedicated diabetes clinic in the US. Today, his clinic has become the Joslin Diabetes Center at Harvard. So his thinking was, this is a very dangerous drug. So let's minimize its use and maximize the use of diet to control the disease, which makes an enormous amount of sense. So you remember, there are always two ways to control blood sugar, two significant, the first order ways to control it are drugs or diet. So with diet, we could be fairly confident that we're not doing harm, fairly confident, not completely confident. And with drugs, we have no idea because there's always risks and benefits. So as I said, as this period went along, other people argued, look, this drug is so powerful, just let people eat what they want. And Joslin eventually went along with it well. So by the time they started manifesting the complications of the disorder in the 1920s, 1930s, and you see this tidal wave of diabetic complications, which is how it was described, you have no idea what's causing it. So remember, they didn't do clinical trials until the late 1940s. So it could be the long-term consequences of living with diabetes, because these patients with type 1 never lived more than 2 or 3 years after diagnosis. So it could be unavoidable. And that's what the people pushing for these liberal diets argued. It could be that they weren't doing as good enough a job controlling their blood sugar, which is what Jocelyn was arguing. So you wanted more intensive insulin therapy, better in tuned with the diet, and the diet better tuned to the insulin therapy. It could be the insulin therapy as well.
So definitely diet. Sorry.
Yeah. Endocrine diseases, endocrinology is a science of hormone. Hormonal diseases are defined not just by having too little of the hormone, but by having too much of the hormone. There's hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. And diabetes books will endocrine textbooks will discuss them both. We've always known that too much of a hormone is as bad as too little, or can be bad in its own ways, or worse. Because of the way the field developed, they never got a chance to understand that. So the other aspect is type 2 diabetic patients with type 2 diabetes don't need insulin. Their problem is not a lack of insulin, it's a resistance to the insulin that's being secreted. And because their cells are resistant to insulin, the pancreas responds by secreting more of it. So they actually have too much insulin in their bloodstream rather than too little. Those people also got insulin. So now you have a disorder of too much insulin, and you treat it by giving more insulin, which some people today will describe as throwing gasoline on a fire to put it out. This has been the standard of care for decades. So another way to look at it, instead of diagnose, and again, you can't blame the doctors because they just didn't know these things. And by the time they found out, so insulin's discovered in 1921, arguably it's not until 40 years later, 1960, that they begin to learn that 95% of their cases are not insulin deficient, they're insulin resistant. Those are the patients with type 2. But by now they've locked in their thinking about how to treat the disease. And it takes 10 to 15 years for this understanding of insulin, arguably 25 years, before physicians really, the message is really disseminated that type 2 diabetes is a disorder of insulin resistance, not insulin deficiency. And that's 25 more years where the doctors have locked in their thinking about how to treat the disease. So this is what I mean is...
Doesn't insulin extend the life of someone with type 2 diabetes?
Not necessarily. That's what's so fascinating. So then the other issue, and as I discuss in the book, the diabetes community gets far more credit than the obesity community in this sense, is that they were willing to do some very ambitious, long, expensive clinical trials to test their hypotheses. So for instance, one of their hypotheses is giving intensive insulin therapy to patients with type 1 diabetes would minimize the complications, lessen the complications. That was a study called the Diabetes Control and Complications Trial in the 1980s. Nationwide study, it showed that it did indeed lessen complications somewhat, but at a price of creating more hypoglycemic episodes and at the price of creating weight gain, which would make these patients more susceptible to these other complications of the disease. As these diabetes specialists did these large, ambitious trials, they basically refuted all their beliefs. So for instance, in the 2000s, there was a series of 3 trials, the Accord trial, I'm going to forget their names, the Veterans Administration diabetes trial, and I forget the third one, that were testing the idea that intensive insulin therapy in patients with type 2 diabetes would have fewer complications. And instead, it turned out that they died more frequently, that it lessened their life rather than. But again, one of the problems with medical science is medical establishment is if you believe something throughout your entire career, it's very hard to accept the message of a clinical trial telling you that your belief system was wrong. So by the 2000s, the accepted wisdom about both type 1 and type 2 diabetes is it is a chronic degenerative disease, progressive disease. So by that it means the drugs aren't going to cure it, and it's going to continue to get worse. So you're going to continue to have to add new drugs or increase the doses. And I quote in the introduction to the book a 2017 American Diabetes Association report in which the doctors said, the biggest barrier to successful treatment of this disease is the hesitancy of physicians, the inertia, they call it physician inertia, to continue prescribing new drugs in higher doses. And meanwhile, the complications of the disease, the blindness, the amputations and nerve damage, the heart disease, that you have no idea if that's better or worse than it would be without insulin therapy, but with diet therapy, because that's wasn't tested until, again, beginning in the early 2000s. So for type 1 diabetes, insulin will keep those patients alive. It's a wonder drug. It's absolutely a necessity. For type 2, it could be a terrible mistake. And type 2 patients are 95% of the patients with 90 to 95% of the patients.
And obviously it's best if people can have a good diet and healthy diet and exercise, of course. I mean, that recommendation goes for everyone. For type 2 patients with type 2 diabetes, my understanding was that, if they can improve their diet, that's great. But if they can't, or if diet's not enough, that the diabetes, that insulin, despite the potential harms, ultimately does allow those people to live longer. But what you're saying is that that's not the case. Like if you have type 2 diabetes, your lifespan is not prolonged with insulin?
No, at this point in time, if you're diagnosed with diabetes, your prognosis is better than ever before in history. That's undeniable. And particularly
because of insulin. Because of
not
insulin, right?
with type 2, it's not necessarily because of insulin. Actually, again, one of the
Then what's the reason? What's the reason then?
there are these other drugs, GLP-1 agonists, are,
Right.
for type 2 diabetes, they appear to be very effective drugs. Hopefully, they'll replace insulin as therapy. The issue is, you said if the diet isn't enough. And so the argument I'm making in the book, one of the arguments is the diet was never tested. So once insulin was discovered, that locked in the idea that patients could eat their carbohydrates, basically have their cake and eat it too, and insulin will cover any necessary problems with the diet. And if you're not controlling your blood sugar, you don't change the diet, you just try and change the insulin dosing, and new insulins were discovered, longer lasting insulins, slower acting insulins. There was always a new drug in the pipeline that could allow you to control your blood sugar without having to worry about the diet. And then in the 1960s, and this was a story I told in the second science investigation I did, and in my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, we embraced this idea that saturated fat and high-fat diets were the primary cause of heart disease. And so became the definition of a healthy diet, became a low-fat diet rich in fruits and vegetables. And this became the diet that was prescribed for diabetic patients. So the idea was in healthy patients, in non-diabetic individuals, we get heart disease because of the saturated fat content of our diets. And so we should eat low-fat diets. And patients with diabetes get heart disease because of the uncontrolled blood sugar. That's why their heart disease risk is increased. But they could mitigate that risk by also eating low-fat diets, even though low-fat diets are high in carbohydrates. So you're basically trading off cholesterol control for blood sugar control. In a population in which that the reason they get diabetes, they're at an increased risk is because of their poorly controlled blood sugar and perhaps their poorly controlled insulin, which you don't know for sure one way or the other. So you really just don't know. In the first major clinical trial that was done in the 1960s was done to test the first oral blood sugar lowering agent, tolbutamide. It was a pill you could take by mouth that would lower blood sugar. There was a congressman whose niece had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, or with diabetes period, and She was prescribed tolbutamide, and this congressman asked a local diabetes specialist in Cleveland whether or not tolbutamide would make her healthy, and he said, "We have no idea." So the congressman helped him raise money to do a clinical trial, and it turned out that not only did tolbutamide not extend the lives of these patients or reduce complications of the disease more so than diet alone, insulin was also tested, and the insulin didn't benefit. And the community responded by assuming we must have done the trial incorrectly, which is always possible. Although if it had gotten the results they expected, they would not have said that. But
to be clear, though, like, and as far as it pertains to Ozempic, like, there's no known risks or downsides to Ozempic. You're speculating that there could be, maybe, right?
Yes, I am speculating that there could be maybe, and it makes me nervous.
But maybe there's not.
And maybe there's not. Well, again, and we talked about this before we got on the air. Very well, what a story that could be an analogy to this is the benzodiazepine story for anxiety, depression, insomnia. So these are very Klonopin is one of the most famous drugs in this category. I always forget if Ambien is part of this category. Xanax is, Valium. And these are drugs that, for people who suffer, for instance, from insomnia, are wonder drugs. You take Klonopin, you sleep. So originally, and I remember when Ambien was first prescribed, it was you would get a 2-week supply from your doctor, and that was it. Because they didn't know you were supposed to retrain your body to sleep over 2 weeks, and they wouldn't give any more. But then you slowly think, okay, this is benign. We could give it for as long as people need it. It got easier and easier to get long-term prescriptions. And you get to the point where, you know, people have been on these drugs for 20 years. And then but eventually our bodies get used to drugs. So if you're not addressing the underlying cause, a likelihood is that you will start either need higher doses, as is when you think of a disorder as a progressive disorder like diabetes, or you start having side effects that you might not have had when you were younger. The journalist Robert Whitaker, you should have him on your show. He's in Boston. He wrote a couple of tremendous books on this subject, Anatomy of an Epidemic and Mad in America, and started a website. And it's all about basically what happens after 10 or 20 years on these drugs and the damage they could do. It's a mirror of the insulin story in diabetes. And again, it's one of the issues with journalists doing these stories like myself and Bob Whitaker is it's easy after a while to sort of put us in a corner and forget about us. You know, we're one voice saying, and it's a Cassandra-like voice saying, whoa, wait a minute, just slow down here. You know, because you're not giving this drug it's not like taking, I don't know, an antibiotic for.
But don't some people need drugs? Like, sometimes you need, you know, a medicine, even though it might have side effects. Like,
I said, the problem with these drugs is they're wonder drugs. They're so effective. I mean, I probably know.
Aren't there cases where you need to have a certain medicine?
Absolutely,
insulin. So maybe some people need Ozempic because if they don't get it, then they're going to die.
I know people who I think Ozempic is an amazing drug. They're not going to. Well, again, obesity associates with all kinds of chronic diseases. It's an open question whether it. You know, morbid obesity is I think it's a terrible burden. The fat acceptance movement probably would prefer I don't phrase it like that. The very complicated situation. The question is always, when you're putting somebody on a powerful drug for life, an expensive, powerful drug for life. Let's take an extreme example. Say we have a girl who's 16-year-old and suffers from obesity, and diet has not helped her, and diet is a burden for everyone, whether it works or not. And so she's put on Ozempic and she loses 50 pounds. And now 10 years later, she's happily married and wants to get pregnant. Okay, this is probably the scenario that worries me the most. I don't think we have any idea what Ozempic does during pregnancy to the fetus, to the child. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I hope I'm wrong about that, and it's very well understood from animal studies. But a likely scenario is that the woman wants to get off. If she tries to get off the drug when she's pregnant, she's going to be gaining weight back while she's pregnant. We know that weight gain, excessive weight gain during pregnancy, comes with all kinds of long-term complications for the child. It's a scenario known as fetal programming, and the child will
Is
be born.
it dangerous to be pregnant while on Ozempic?
We don't know. But we also know that if the doctor says, okay, if you're planning on getting pregnant, you should go off the Ozempic. Now she's going to be gaining weight when she gets pregnant. And we know that it's, again, they're very complex situations. I don't know what the answers are. And I hope I'm wrong. Because I can imagine Cassandra, in the Troy going through her life going, geez, I wish I'm wrong about this, but don't let the horse.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff we could worry about, but without evidence, I mean, I could worry a meteor is going to hit the world, but if we don't have evidence that Ozempic is harmful for pregnant women, why are we spending time worrying about it?
I'm just raising the possibility that it's something you should know about, because at some point people are going to be wanting. I mean, it's assuredly already happened. And again, you have to, as I say, context is everything in these things. So my context is in writing the diabetes book is, like I said, if insulin is a legitimate analogy, then the problem with insulin, again, it was a wonder drug. But people in the 1920s saying, why worry about it? It's keeping these people alive. Let them eat what they want. And that turned out to be a tremendous mistake. Let me give you a different way to think about it, again, based on diabetes. So this was a story that was told to me by a journalist who was he was a chef who became a journalist, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in his mid-30s. When you're diagnosed with diabetes, most of us don't give it a lot of thought. So you're diagnosed with disease, suddenly you're sort of dumped into disease land. Like I think of the carnival games where you throw the baseball, and if you hit the target, the person plunges into the water. Well, that person is what happens when you're diagnosed with these diseases. So suddenly you're trying to learn as much about it as you can while you're simultaneously coping with the existential terror of the disease. And so his doctor says to him, look, this is the problem. You don't secrete enough insulin. You have an insulin deficiency disorder. And as a result, you cannot metabolize the carbohydrates in your diet safely. So what we're going to do is we're going to have you eat so many carbohydrates for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then you're going to dose your insulin to cover those carbohydrates. And the journalist Ross says to his doctor, well, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You're telling me that because I have diabetes, carbohydrates are not toxic to me now, and insulin is the antidote. So you want me to eat the toxin and take the antidote. And wouldn't it be better off if I just didn't eat the toxin? Which is sort of the dietary approach to these perspectives, if there is a dietary solution to these disorders. But anytime you take a drug, so you can imagine, and again, I discuss in the book Rethinking Diabetes, the clinical trials that have been done through the 2000s, most notably by actually a San Francisco-based startup named Virta Health, that have demonstrated that type 2 diabetes in particular can be put into remission with dietary therapy. So particularly a ketogenic diet. You could also do it apparently with calorie-restricted diets, has been reported in England. I'm skeptical about the long-term effects, and I would love to see a trial comparing the two and sussing that out. But So you're diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Again, now we're talking about 95% of the patients. The patients who are not, this used to be called non-insulin dependent diabetes because you don't need insulin to survive. And you're told we're going to take two approaches. You can have a choice of two approaches. So the conventional approach is you're going to pretty much eat what you want, a healthy version of what you want, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean meats, nuts, sugar in moderation, meat in moderation, fish, chicken, and we're going to give you drugs to control the blood sugar and control the symptoms. So, oral hypoglycemics or GLP-1 agonists, or pick your poison for the blood sugar. If your blood pressure goes up, we have drugs for that. If you've had neuropathies, that's a little more difficult. Hopefully we won't have to amputate anything, but you never know. And if you start getting retinopathies, we have drugs and surgical techniques for that. They involve sticking needles in your eyeballs, but people get used to it. The alternative is we put you on dietary therapy and the disease goes into remission. And as long as you adhere to the diet, you will not manifest symptoms of the disease.
I'll choose the diet.
No, you can't metabolize the carbohydrate content of the diet, so you don't eat carbohydrates, you replace them with fat. So it's a high-fat, very low-carb diet. It's keto for all intents and purposes. The VERTA trial demonstrated that dietary approach can put this disease into remission. So remember, the conventional thinking is that diabetes is a chronic progressive disorder that's only going to get worse. Dietary therapies trials, clinical trials, have demonstrated that it's not a chronic progressive disorder unless you eat a carbohydrate-rich diet. Okay, so the chronic progressive nature of the disease seems to be a response to the diet. And the point I make in the book is that the ketogenic diet was never tested until the early 2000s. It's now been tested there are more clinical trials testing keto for diabetes and other disease states in any diet, any other diet in existence. There's 200 trials or so that have been completed and probably another couple hundred that are in the works for virtually every disease state we can imagine. We know it's a benign trial in the short term. We know that it has some remarkable effects, including putting diabetes into remission. So when we talk about the drugs being beneficial, and clearly they're a disorder, I'm not putting down the whole pharmaceutical industry. I don't have the background or the understanding to even take that on. I could take on how physicians have thought about diabetes for 100 years. And I could talk about all the mistakes that were made. And I could say I can see those mistakes being repeated in the Ozempic story. Doesn't mean the physicians won't be right, that they, in jumping to conclusions about the nature of the disease from the effect of the drug or the apparent effect of the drug, they won't be right. But I can guarantee you that they're jumping to conclusions. And it's very dangerous in medical science to jump to conclusions, because after a while you forget that you had jumped and these unproven assertions become accepted as dogmatic facts.
Got it. There's a lot more I could ask there, Gary, but we're running out of time. So I have one final question.
Okay.
You and Peter Attia have worked closely together. What's something where you disagree, and what's your perspective?
Okay, so Peter and I worked together on this not-for-profit, NUSI, which Peter left in 2016-17, and I eventually shut down in 2021. One of the things we wanted to test, one of the goals was to raise money to actually do scientific experiments, which are different than diet experiments, to test the hypothesis that fat storage and obesity are caused by the carbohydrate content of the diet, working primarily through the hormone insulin, diabetes again, rather than how much you eat and exercise, the conventional calories in, calories out model. We funded 2 studies that tested that hypothesis directly. They were interpreted in antipodal ways. One was interpreted as confirming this carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, and one was interpreted as confirming the energy balance model of obesity. And my takeaway was that when you fund experiments, when you do experiments that have never been done before, you learn how you screwed up the experiment more than anything else. In an ideal world, we'd have raised more money to do better experiments based on what we had learned from these first two, but with Peter leaving and me not willing to put in the time, we never got to that point. In Peter's book, Outlive, and in his practice, he now promotes an energy balance view of obesity and weight loss. So on some level, you get fatter because you eat too much or are physically inactive, and you solve the problem when you lose weight. The only way diets work when they get you to eat less. That's kind of the message he conveys, as I understand it. That was the hypothesis we were testing in the not-for-profit. I find it naive. Biologically, physiologically, endocrinology, I'm kind of stunned that Peter no longer does, that he's willing to accept this as an explanation. And at the very least,
his theory is that it's not diet, it's exercise.
No, his theory, I mean, diets work, he says, when you eat less. I think that's actually
So
even
his theory is that it's just purely calories in, calories out.
It's ultimately it's calories.
And so where you differ is you say it's not just calories, it's the content of what you're eating, specifically carbohydrates matter a lot.
And although it's not just that it's not just calories. I don't believe you can understand anything meaningful about obesity as a disease state if you think of it as a calorie in, calorie out problem. It's a description of what happens. Like when Peter says, again, I'm hoping I'm communicating his message correctly, when he says obesity is caused, diets work when you eat less or when you're in negative energy balance, I would say, yeah, of course, if you're losing weight, you're in negative energy balance. The question is what causes a negative energy balance? That could be a conscious restriction on calories consumed and an increase in energy expenditure, or it can be created by carbohydrate restriction and changing the hormonal environment that the fat cells see. And as we tried to do for 6 years at NUSI, those hypotheses can be tested. Until they are tested, you don't make dogmatic statements. So I'm a little bit mystified by it, but
what do you think he's overlooking or that he's taking for granted, which he should not be?
The endocrine regulation of fat storage.
Meaning what?
Fat cells don't see how much, and this is, I often, when I have tried to discuss this with Peter, I often use arguments that he himself used back when he believed what I believe. So fat cells don't see how much you're eating and exercising. Fat cells are responding to the hormonal signals that are secreted in response to what you're eating. And to some extent, they see the fat and carbohydrates that are in the circulation, the fatty acids and triglycerides in the circulation, and the level of blood sugar. But then whether or not they will take up that fat and whether or not they will release it is determined hormonally and primarily by the hormone insulin, which is where this carbohydrate insulin model comes from. Peter knows that. He says as much in his book, talks about insulin being a hormone that basically locks fat in fat cells. So that implies that if insulin is elevated, you will be getting fatter. And if you want to get thinner, you have to lower insulin. And that's a response to the carbohydrate content of the diet, not necessarily the calorie content.
I mean, could it be that both things matter or that it's calories and the content?
I think calories are a valuable way to quantify how much food you're eating or how much of these different macronutrients you're eating. But as soon as you say that obesity is caused by taking in more calories than we expend, which has been the conventional wisdom 60 years, and it was a competing hypothesis for 50 years before that. As soon as you say that, you've taken a complex physiological and endocrine system. Here's one way to think about it: calories in and calories out. That's what you're eating and what you're expending. In the 20th century, when that idea, late 19th century, early 20th century, when that idea started to get locked in, it was because the only thing nutritionists could measure in the food we consume that could be relevant to obesity was the energy content of the food. And then they had these devices called calorimeters that allowed them to measure how much energy people expended. And so these were the only factors they had. And so they came up with the theory of obesity depending on what they could measure.
But isn't it true, like cheese, for example, has no carbs, right? For the most part.
For the most part.
And if I ate, 15 pounds of cheese every day with 0 carbs, I'd get fat, right? I'd get
right, but that doesn't mean that people who get fat got fat because they ate 15 pounds of food. There's a difference between consciously forcing yourself to get fatter, okay, and people who manifest obesity.
You're saying in reality, the people who end up getting obese, the way you get there, even though you could get there by eating 15 pounds of cheese.
Well, actually, it's not sure. I don't think you could. I bet you personally could do as an experiment. I bet you'd gain around 10 pounds, but you would not become clinically obese. You'd gain some weight. You'd find it very hard to keep it up day in and day out. And after a while, your weight would plateau at maybe 10. I'm speculating, but you would not necessarily become obese and in fact, as I discussed in my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, there were researchers who tried to do these experiments, both on themselves and on others. The most famous example, and this is, by the way, why I recommended we could do this as an entirely different episode of your show. Late 1960s in Vermont, in a state prison, a researcher named Ethan Thims decided he was going to take prisoners and force them to get fat and study how different diets did it. And the first attempt was to do it with an Atkins diet, even though Atkins had published in the magazine but had yet to write his book. And his researchers, I interviewed the ones who were there. Virtually all of them were still alive when I was doing my first book. And they described these prisoners sitting there with plates of pork chops in front of them and refusing to eat them. They couldn't get them to gain weight. So eventually they had to switch to a different method, which was, a baseline diet, which had carbs versus either carb calories or fat calories. And they found out that they described it as heroic to get these people to eat enough fat to get them to gain weight, but eventually they did. Huh. And yet they would also say that they could eat 10,000 calories a day of carbohydrates and go to bed hungry. So there's all these interactions between fuel availability in your periphery versus whether or not you're hungry that is actually... It's a very complex story, but let me just guarantee you it is not as simple as you think. And the one thing you can't do is say, if I ate 5,000 calories a day, wouldn't I get fatter? You would. You might even on a ketogenic diet. It's conceivable you might even doing that on a carnivore diet.
But your point is that it's much less likely. It's much less appetizing. Like you're not going to have 5,000 calories on a ketogenic because it's not as palatable.
The assumption is always that if we see someone with obesity, that's how they got fat. So let me give you another example, which in my book, Why We Get Fat, was maybe the second chapter. Imagine you gain 20 pounds in the next decade. Okay, so right now your BMI, you had told me you're a triathlete, but let's say your BMI is 25. You don't look, what's your height and weight?
I'm 5'8", 170. I'm heavy
okay,
right now.
So you're probably up around 27.
Hope not, but yeah.
That's all right. I was a football player. I live around 29, 30, and I go through life saying, I'm clinically obese. I look like a linebacker, but technically. Anyway, the point is, let's say you gain 20 pounds in the next 10 years. So now you're 190. Now I'm sure you're over BMI over 30, okay, at 5'8". Could you do it eating cheese? I don't think so, but let's just figure out how many calories you have to store as fat every day to accumulate that 20 pounds. So a pound of fat is around 3,500 calories. So there's 360. So you're gaining 2 pounds a year, and you're storing 2 pounds of fat a year in your fat tissue. Again, I'm simplifying because some of that is going to be lean tissue, which is fewer calories per gram. But let's say it's all fat. 2 pounds a year is 7,000 calories of fat that you're storing every year. You divide that by 365 days in a year. For all intents and purposes, you are storing 20 calories a day as fat that your lean friend who stays lean is not. So that's your, bless you, that's your positive energy balance. 20 calories a day. Okay? That's 3 almonds. 3 peanuts, 2 gummy bears. It's a bite of food. It's a couple of sips of Coke. So now you have to explain.
On top of the elevated, but your calorie needs go up and up and up as your weight goes up. And so that 3
Yeah,
almonds, the gummy bears that you're saying
this
on
is
top
always,
of your elevated.
This is always the excess. This is always the excess.
But to be clear, like, and this is maybe an unnecessary detail, but to be clear, when you say let's stick with the example 3 almonds, you're saying 3 almonds on top of your basal metabolic rate, which is increasing along with your rate.
Absolutely. But the point is, that's what you have to eat less of if you believe that obesity is caused by eating more than you expend. So on any particular day, you're in energy balance, and then you're exceeding the energy balance by 20 calories a day. So in theory, if you eat 20 calories less every day, you won't gain the weight. Or you could even make it more extreme. In theory, if you eat 200 calories less every day, you won't gain the weight. Okay, that's what that, and again, these numbers, I didn't come up with this. This is the kind of discussion they had 120 years ago in the textbooks. How can obesity be an energy balance disorder if this is the daily increase that people, 2 pounds of fat a year is common?
No, but again, but if I gain 10 more pounds and then all of a sudden my daily caloric intake requirements in order to maintain that weight have now increased by X number of calories.
True.
So the term excess, the
We're
notion
always
of the term,
talking about the excess.
but the notion of the word excess in real numbers, that is 3 almonds plus 10%. So it's like, we're not talking about 30 calories. We're talking about 400 calories plus 3 almonds, and then it's 600 calories plus 3 almonds because we have to account for the amount of caloric. So it's not really fair to say. But the point is, it's not 3 almonds. It's a lot of almonds.
No, we're just talking about the amount of calories stored as fat every day. Your fat tissue is increasing by 20 calories of fat per day. That's what you're trying to stop from happening. That's independent of all that other increase in metabolic thing. I'm just saying every day your fat tissue is storing 20 calories of fat. If you're gaining weight at the rate of 2 pounds a year, some people gain it at 10 pounds a year, then that's going to be 200 calories of fat that's being stored every day. But that's still not a lot considering you're eating 2,000, 3,000 calories a day. Even if the amount that you need to eat to remain in energy balance goes up, you still have to explain why your fat tissue is storing 20 calories a day. You can explain that with an endocrine hypothesis. That's the kind of thing like when you're growing as a child, your lean tissue and your bones, are growing by a similar amount of calories every day. That's all driven by growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor and other it's a hormonal phenomena that's causing your body to get bigger. But you cannot explain it by a calories in, calories out issue. And what you'll find is that people don't attempt to. So you have people like me saying, look, I get it. Like Peter, look, I get it. Okay? People lose weight when they eat less. But let's take the period of time when they were gaining weight. and ask why didn't they eat less enough to prevent that weight gain from happening, considering that that weight gain is on the order of 20 or 30 or 40 calories per day. How do you explain that without saying, which is how researchers 100 years ago got around this, by saying, well, they just don't have willpower, or they're ignorant, or they don't know enough.
Yeah.
And Peter
No,
himself is a prime example, because he talks about gaining 30 pounds of fat while he was working out 3 hours a day. In his book, he talks about his wife asking him if he could be a little, how did she phrase it? A little less not lean, after he's just swum from one island in Hawaii to the other, and he's standing on the beach and he's 30 pounds overweight. And he's
how is he overweight? What was he doing?
He was getting fatter despite working out 3 hours a
What was
day.
he doing? Eating a lot? What was he?
I think today he would have to say he was eating too much.
Well, I mean, what else would he say? It seems like
I
the
don't
only
know.
thing
Get him on
someone
your
could
show
say.
and ask him.
Yeah.
I don't
No,
know
well,
if
so, Gary, I got a lot more to ask you about, but we're out of time. So let me end the recording, and then let's maybe chat for a moment. And thank you so much.
Thank